So we were looking at people who are prevented from entering. The expression in the Mishnah is entering the Kehillah, and the Halacha interprets this as marrying into the Kehillah. And the Mishnah is going to continue in the third Mishnah of the 8th chapter. Ammoniyu umoavi asurim, a Moabite and an Ammonite are forbidden, and that means forbidden to enter the congregation. In the same way that we have a pasuk actually. It's a pasuk in Devarim, Lo yavo Ammoni or Moavi b'kehal Hashem. Ammonite and Moabites shouldn't enter the assembly of the Lord. Gam dor asiri, even the 10th generation, Lo yavo lahem b'kehal Hashem ad olam, forever and ever, because they didn't meet you with bread and water when you came out of Egypt. It's very interesting that the Ammonites and the Moabites in these Pasukim are contrasted with the Edomites and the Egyptians. The Torah goes on to say, Lo teta'ev ad Edomi ki achichahu. You shouldn't hate an Edomite because he's your brother. And then Lo tita'ev mitzri ki ger hayita b'artso. You shouldn't abhor an Egyptian because you were a stranger in his land. So there's something about the Edomite that's essentially the descendants of the descendants of Esav. So they're our cousins, the descendants of Esav. And even though, by the way, they attacked us, Amalek comes from Edom. Even though they attacked us coming out of Egypt, we shouldn't hate them. And similarly, the Egyptians, even though they enslaved us, we don't hate. But there's something about Ammon and Moab. These are the descendants of Avraham, actually, the descendants of Avraham via Lot and Lot's daughters. There's something about them that doesn't come into the community until the 10th generation. And of course, we're struck by the fact that Ruth is a Moabite. And the kingdom of the kingship in Israel, descended from King David, is actually descended from Ruth. So that royal house of Israel comes from Moab, even though the Torah says a Moabite cannot enter the community, and the Mishnah articulates the halacha very clearly. Let's go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. Ammoni u'Moavi asurim ve'isuran isur olam. Ammonite and the Moabites are forbidden forever. But the Mishnah goes on to say, but their women are permitted at once. The prohibition only applies to men, not to women. And I think this prohibition is probably included in the Midrashim on Ruth, because of course Ruth was permitted. And there's a saying in the Talmud in Yevamot on page 77. Amar Rava said, and he's quoting now. Rava is quoting, Kach Mukublani mi beit dino shel Shmuel haramati. This is the tradition that I received from the Bet Din of Shmuel from Ramah. This is Shmuel the prophet. So we're in the time of the Shoftim. Of course, that means we're in the time of Sefer Ruth. Sefer Ruth is at the time Bimei Shvot HaShoftim, at the time that the judges judged. So we're in the time of Shmuel now. And the ruling, according to Rava sitting in Babylon, right? So he's sitting in Babylon in the 3rd century of the current era. So he must be 1,000 years after Shmuel. But he's saying, I've got this tradition from the Bet Din of Shmuel, Ammoni velo Ammonite, an Ammonite man, but not an Ammonite woman. And similarly, Moavi velo Moavite, a Moabite man, but not a Moabite woman. And of course, none of these distinctions apply today anyway, because after Sennacherib mixed up all the nations, nobody actually knows who anybody is. And that's a different tradition of the Talmud. But certainly, in terms of this Mishnah, the halacha is we Ammoni velo Ammonite, Moavi velo Moabite, a male but not a female Ammonite. And this is exactly the halacha in the Mishnah. Aval asurin olam, aval nekvetehem mutarot miyod. Their women are permitted at once. They don't have to wait. And as for the Egyptian and the Edomite, who we can't hate, the Egyptian and the Edomite are only forbidden until the third generation. But their men and their women are treated the same. And Rabbi Shimon is going to object. Al-Halacha, I think, does not go according to Rabbi Shimon, but he is going to object. And we talked before that the Mishnah retains, it preserves many, many traditions that are not preserved, are not accepted by the Halacha, but they're still preserved. Amar Rabbi Shimon, Kal v'chomer hadvarim, I can actually make a logical deduction. Uma im b'mekom she'asar et hazacharim isur olam, itirat hanokavot miyad. Look, if in a situation where the men are permanently forbidden, and yet the women are permitted immediately, makom shelo asar et hazacharim eila ad shloshat arod eino din she'natir et hanokavot miyad. If the men are only forbidden until a third generation, isn't it a logical inference? How much more so should the women be permitted immediately? He can work it out logically. And it's very interesting. We learn something about the process of halacha here, because the sages will not accept his logical deduction. Amrulo, im halacha nekabel. If you've actually taught us a halacha that you've learned, in other words, if you've received this from your teachers as a halacha, we'll accept it. Im halacha nakabal. If it's a halacha you've learned, we'll accept it. V'im ladin yesh tshuva. If it's only a logical argument, there might be an answer. There might be a refutation. We can't accept logic because logic is always going to have a possible refutation. Whereas if you've heard it as a tradition from your teachers, we'll accept this as halacha. There's a very similar story told about Hillel. Hillel comes up from Babylon, bright young man, comes to Jerusalem. He's questioned by the Bet Din, actually by the B'nai B'tera, as to what you should do to bring your knife to the Bet Mikdash when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat. And he says you shove the knife into the hair of your sheep, and then the sheep will carry the knife. And they argue about it for 3 days. And they say, look, we do not accept. He brings them all the logical arguments, and they don't accept the logical arguments. And then finally he said, Kach v'kach shemati mi Shemaya ve'Avtalion. This, thus and thus I heard from Shemaya and Avtalion, and they accept it straight away, and they make him head of the Bet Din. So there's something about the received tradition which is more powerful than the logical inference. As it happens, he replied along those lines, Amar lahem, look, Lochi, ela halacha ani yomer. I'm actually telling you a halacha. I think they don't accept him anyway, but he says, I'm telling you a halacha. And then the Mishnah goes on to say, filling out the list of people who are never allowed to marry into the community, mamzerim unatinim asurim. A mamzer and a natin are both forbidden. A mamzer is the product of a forbidden union, and a natin, the word comes from Joshua, and it actually refers to Gibeonites. But in the world of the Mishnah, it actually refers to any non-Jews. And this is not halacha today. It refers to the Gibeonites were accepted by Joshua on conversion, but it was found that their conversion was not really truthful or 100%, and so they were forbidden to marry into the community. Mamzerim unatinin asurim ve'isuran isur olam. Mamzerim and natinim are forbidden, and their prohibition is forbidden. Echad zacharim ve'echad nekevot. It doesn't matter whether they're men or women, and this is why, of course, in modern times, or certainly in recent historical times, if someone were a mamzer, they would just say to you, look, maybe good to move to the next town. Now, what about people whose fertility was damaged? Because this whole discussion about people who can come in to the community began with a discussion about marriage to someone who's men with testes who were crushed, or whose penis was cut or slashed in some way, and they couldn't bear children. Now, in the next Mishnah, we're going to talk about women who couldn't bear children. But Rabbi Yehoshua is going to begin that discussion by saying, Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shemati she'asaris choletz vecholtzim leishto. I heard. So again, he's got the tradition. He's not working this out by logical deduction, although maybe we might be able to, but he's got a tradition. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shemati she'asaris choletz vecholtzim leishto. I heard that a eunuch performs chalitza, and that we perform chalitza essentially for his wife. But he said, I've also heard, vehasaris lo choletz velo choltzim lishto. I've also heard that a eunuch doesn't perform chalitza, and we don't perform chalitza for his wife. Ve'einli lefaresh, and I just don't understand. I've heard two opposite traditions, and I don't understand what they're doing. So Rabbi Akiva is the student of Rabbi Yoshua, but he's the brilliant young man. So Rabbi Akiva is going to explain. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ani afaresh, I'll explain for you. Saris adam choletz vecholtzim. A man-made eunuch performs chalitza, and the chalitza is performed for his wife. Shehaita lo sha'at kasher. Sha'at kosher. There was a time when he was kasher. And Rabbi Akiva is, when Rabbi Akiva is talking about Saris Adam, he's saying a eunuch who was essentially castrated. He was castrated by, well, I guess he was medically castrated. So there was a time when he was not a eunuch. And if there was a time when he was not a eunuch, he could perform chalitza, and the chalitza can be performed for his wife. And then Rabbi Akiva is going to explain saris chama. A saris chama means a saris by the sun, literally. But the rabbis are talking here about a eunuch who effectively, when the sun shone on him, was always a eunuch, i.e. the sun never shone on him when he was not a eunuch. And it's translated actually by Safaria as I've left the translation, as a eunuch by nature. Saris Chama is someone who is always a eunuch. And Rabbi Akiva is going to say, Saris Chama lo choletz velo choltzim lishto shelo hayta sha'at kosher. Rabbi Akiva is going to say, if he's always been a eunuch, and he doesn't have to perform chalitza, and we don't perform chalitza for his wife, because there was never a time when he was fit. Remember that the whole purpose of chalitza is to release from yibum. And the whole purpose of yibum is to raise up it's either to raise up a child for your deceased brother, or your brother might do this for you to raise up a child for you. But if you never had a house in Israel because you were infertile, or you were not able to raise up a house for your deceased brother because you are infertile, the whole issue of chalitza and yibum, it just doesn't apply. So as far as Rabbi Akiva is saying, look, if you were always infertile, then the whole issue of chalitza and yibum doesn't apply to you at all. And Rabbi Eliezer is going to disagree. Rabbi Eliezer, contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, maybe slightly older, but a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. He's Rabbi Eliezer is essentially half a generation before Rabbi Akiva. So he's an older contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, lo, ki eila saris chama choletz vechotzin lishto sheyesh lo rufua. Rabbi Eliezer is an optimist. He says, Saris Chama, that's a eunuch by nature, someone who's always been a eunuch. Choletz vecholtzim leishto, he performs chalitza, and a chalitza can be performed for his wife, because maybe he'll be cured. Maybe we have hope. We don't really understand the medicine. We don't understand the biology. Maybe there'll be a time when he'll be cured. But on the other hand, Saris Adam lo choletz velo choltzim leishto she'ein lo rufua. But a man-made eunuch neither performs chalitza, nor is chalitza performed for his wife, because he just cannot be cured. Once a medical castration has been carried out, you can't do anything about that. Now, we're going to go back to the tradition. He'id Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera is going to give evidence. He's going to testify that he's heard a tradition. Again, we're going to go on the tradition. We're not going to go on the, if you like, the deduction or the medical evidence. Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera testified. Al ben Magoset. There was this guy called Ben Magoset. Shehayab Yerushalayim Saris Adam. He was living in Jerusalem and he was a man-made eunuch. He'd been castrated. It was incredibly common, by the way, in Roman and Persian times to castrate people. Incredibly common. So he lived in Jerusalem and he must have died because they performed Yibum for his wife. Lekayem Divrei Rabbi Akiva, to fulfill the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the brilliant young man, the brilliant young darshan, so we can't be surprised when he is the last opinion mentioned in the Mishnah, and there's evidence that the people of Jerusalem respected his opinion.